Okay.
Also, one of you is having some background noise. I think it's you, Zulu. So,
Oh,
for the sake of the stream quality, could I politely ask you to mute yourself when you're not talking?
is that better now? I turned off my
Yeah,
fridge.
actually, that's better. Thank you. So, sorry to be pushy about it,
That's
but I
fine.
do like to maintain a certain sound quality. All right,
It was a tort
going
violation.
live. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I always felt like the Joker there. We are tonight's entertainment. It's Paleo Angloism back at it again with another stream. Tonight I am joined by Liquid Zulu
Hello there.
and Danny Duchamp.
Hello.
Fuck. Sorry, just stream sound overlap there. Anyway, tonight we are going to be
I
having.
thought he just hates Danny. Biased mod.
Sorry. Right, so today I am joined by Liquid Zulu and Danny Duchamp to talk about I guess you say the differences between the Chicago school and the Austrian school, and for both of my guests to make the case for each school. We've got Liquid Zulu representing the Austrian school and its brand of libertarianism, and we've got Danny representing the Chicago school and its particular brand of libertarianism. So, I guess we'll begin. The first question being, I guess which one of you would like to go first in these questions?
I can.
Yeah, sure. That
Okay,
works.
okay, Danny. Okay, so the first question being, how did you come to the conclusion that your particular brand of economic thought was more preferable to the other?
So I started learning about economics mostly through the Austrian school. I watched an enormous amount of Mises U content, and then I started reading Austrian economics books. And I was mostly convinced by I thought that the arguments were very good, and I still think that they're very good. However, then I encountered David Friedman, the man who you have used Paleo Angloism as your part of your thumbnail there, and he made some anti-Austrian arguments, pro-Chicago school arguments, and they basically convinced me. And so, yeah, I generally support the Chicago school. There may be some specific positions where you could find that I don't quite agree with everything that every Chicago school economist says. However, I have enough disagreements with the Austrian school to be able to resolutely say that I am not an Austrian. Because that's rare at this point amongst libertarians, at least online that I've seen. Most libertarians seem to be Austrians. I wrote an article and turned it into a video called 5 Problems with Austrians. And that probably, the release of that probably marked me just becoming, I suppose, an advocate of the Chicago school on the whole.
I was going to say a dirty outsider.
A dirty outsider, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Liquid Zulu, what would you say your journey to the Austrian school was, in contrast to Danny's?
I was convinced of libertarianism on ethics grounds. Sorry, and I didn't really understand a whole lot about economics. I hadn't read any economics. It wasn't my cup of tea. And I was talking about economics with my friend Nye. It was specifically about it was related to democracy. He was saying that monarchy is preferable to democracy, and this was before I had heard about democracy, the god that failed. So I was like, no way, that's not the case. And it ended up in a discussion over economic methodology. And then I was convinced of the Austrian methodology, and that's when I started learning economics. And I've been an Austrian ever since.
Okay, so You would say that you. So would you say that you didn't really, because of your lack of early on, your lack of economic engagement early on? Would you say that you didn't really? Am I reading you to say that you didn't really engage with the Chicago school much?
No, I only started engaging with the Chicago school after I started after it was being contrasted with the Austrian school, and I agreed with the Austrians on every point of contention that I came across, and I still do.
Okay, so would you like to prod at each other a bit for this question? Because this was the only question in the series of questions which didn't require that, or would you just rather move on?
I've got no prods to
None.
make.
None? Okay.
I believe his story.
Okay, so the first, shall we say, debate question, if you like, even though I'm trying to avoid using the word, just because
You're not doing a good job. You just used it.
Indeed. Where the first question would be, what would you say are the main points that make you believe that your system, your chosen economic system, is preferable? And we'll start again with you, Danny.
Sure. So there were 5 points that I still think are probably the best ones to hit on in my original article, 5 problems with Austrians. I don't think that praxeology entirely works. Probably the best one to start with, though, is rationality. The other 3 being indifference, subjectivity, and utility. But rationality, I think, is the best one in a debate format or a discussion format, sorry. So Austrian rationality is it's a much weaker assumption. And I don't mean weaker as in less good. I mean in the philosophical sense of like, they assume less in their description of rationality. So an Austrian's going to say that, well, a great example Bob Murphy uses is a man doing a rain dance to make it rain is acting rationally in the Austrian sense because he is still using means to achieve ends. And the Austrian system is to build like a tautological, a logical system which is going to result in certain economic conclusions based on that assumption of rationality. I don't think that you actually can get to any economic conclusions from that assumption. I think you need a stronger assumption. The Chicago School assumption is the assumption that people take actions which will successfully fulfill their values, right? They correctly choose the means with that they're going to use. So the man doing the rain dance, he's acting irrationally in the Chicago sense. The reason that that's so important to me is the most fundamental thing that you can say in economics is if 2 people interact, they both benefit, right? So if I trade my pen for your lollipop, then I must value the lollipop more, you must value the pen more, or we wouldn't be willing to trade. Therefore, we have both benefited from that trade. That's not true if one of us is making a mistake, and so you can't really say that. So just that basic Pareto improvement, that basic thing where 2 people mutually benefit, that doesn't work unless you're choosing the correct means. I should clarify, though, that the Chicago School assumption is false, right? It's not true that we always use the correct means to achieve our ends. However, it is close enough to true to be useful in analyzing human behavior. One example of why would be like on the stock market, right? Why should we assume people invest in stocks rationally in the Chicago sense? And the answer there is that people who don't invest very well in the stock market will not have much money to trade with in the future. And so we can think that people will choose good means to achieve their ends on the stock market, even though on the whole, not everyone does. So that's why I think that the Chicago School assumption, despite being strictly speaking false, is actually more useful for making predictions about the real world than the Austrian school.
Okay, so as Liquid Zulu, what makes you think the Austrian school is preferable to the Chicago school?
Sure. So Austrianism is superior because it is correct on methodology, i.e., Austrians see economics as an a priori as opposed to an a posteriori science. So basically, like the kind of logical positivist empiricist interpretation of economics is that, well, economic propositions, they may or may not be true, but you have to actually go out and test them to see whether or not they're true, i.e., you can't have these true statements which are apodictically true and also say something about the real world. The problem with that is that if you have it that statements, basically the logical positivist empiricist take on this is that, well, there are two classes of statements. There are either analytic statements, which just say stuff about language and how words relate to each other, so they don't actually say anything about the real world, and there are empirical statements, which do say something about the real world. But these empirical statements are, on principle, potentially falsifiable. But then, what is the category which this proposition, i.e., the proposition that there are these two types of propositions, which category does this fit into? If it's analytic, then it doesn't say anything about the real world, so we can ignore it. But if it's empirical, then it could be falsified, potentially. But what would it even mean to falsify this, right? Could we go out and test whether or not there are these two different types of propositions? It doesn't really work on those grounds. It also, it ignores that there are sort of two different types of statements we could make. Right. There's more types than this, but here's two different sorts of statements I could make about the world out there. Children prefer McDonald's to Burger King. Germans drink more beer than French people, and women prefer taller, shorter men. That's the first class of statements. You notice with this class, we could potentially, we would have, these are all hypothetical statements. We would have to definitely go out and test these, right? So because we know that because we could formulate the negation of them, and the negation still makes sense. I could say that instead women prefer shorter to taller men. That negation in itself isn't falsified. Then there's a different type of statement, something like there's mutual profit in every voluntary trade, which I'll get to in the back and forth discussion bit, why that is definitely always true. It doesn't make sense to formulate the negation of that. Or interpersonal conflict is only possible in scarce goods. The negation of that doesn't make any sense. Or without private property and factors of production, there can be no prices and factors of production, and therefore there can be no cost accounting, yada yada yada, economic calculation problem. The negation of this statement doesn't make any sense. So we know beforehand, before going out and doing any testing, that it's already true. And this is what makes up the core of economics. It's not looking to historical examples or what the happenstance of arrangement of people's money or whatever happens to be, what people happen to prefer at any given point. It's the necessarily true things given action. That is really the core of economics.
Okay, so we now come to the prodding portion. So since you were the last to speak, so now that you were the last to speak, Zulu, Danny, would you like to begin? Because you could say counter arguing Zulu's point, or
clarifying, maybe
going back and forth.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of clarify a few things. So, you did a little bit of Hoppe's anti-logical positivism there. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but are you claiming that the Chicago school is necessarily a logical positivist school?
Yes, I believe so.
Right. I wouldn't consider myself a logical positivist, right? I would say that I can simply claim that economics is a partially empirical pursuit without saying that I buy into logical positivism, which I don't. I'm like, if you've ever read Michael Humer's work on phenomenal conservatism, it's sort of like intuitionism, essentially. That's my philosophical foundation. It's not positivism. But I suppose couldn't I just say that economics is specifically a mixed pursuit? It's both empirical and logical. but I don't accept logical positivism as a philosophical foundation. Isn't that valid?
Sure, that's fine, but I would say that you would be maybe... Hoppe points this out in his talk, in fact, that, if you were to go to one of these big Chicagoites and you were to say, the better of the mainstream economics people, they do actually treat some propositions as if they are true no matter what, and you don't actually have to go out and test them. But if you really got them down to it, they'd say, oh yes, no, it's hypothetical, you need to test it. So right. I think you'd probably be you're maybe a little more Austrian than some of your Chicagoite friends there.
That doesn't seem... So, Chicago and Austrian are schools of economic thought. Right? Why would it matter what my philosophical underpinnings outside of that are as to what the school... So, if you accept that economics is a mixed field, right? The claims of economics are... Specifically, those ones are testable, which I think that they are. Does that necessarily mean you think things outside of the field of economics are not, are all testable?
Well, I mean, economics, being a science, epistemology does come into play here. So I think that does kind of matter when we're talking about what propositions are economic propositions as opposed to non-economic propositions and stuff like that. I think wider philosophy does matter. The actual philosophical underpinnings do matter on some level, but I'm fine saying that. I'm fine with your saying that, economics has some of these is partially empirical and partially non-empirical. I'm fine with that. I'm not trying to lambast you as a logical positivist here. I'm just trying to say that yes. That is the real underpinning of the Chicago school and much of mainstream economics.
Okay. Well, I think probably seeing as how it would draw us too far into philosophy, we can just agree to disagree on whether a Chicago school supporter is necessarily a logical positivist. And just let me just clarify in that case, can you give me a candidate example of a very simple economic claim that you want to defend, that you can derive logically without that I won't be able to propose a plausible counterexample you'd have to test?
Sure, we can go to the mutual profit and voluntary trade.
Sure. What if I just make a mistake, right? Like I trade for some, I buy a hamburger from you. Turns out I don't like the hamburger.
Sure.
Aren't I worse off?
So basically, when we're talking about profit in this sense, we're talking in ex ante, i.e., when you're making the trade, when you're actually deciding, I want to trade with that guy, you are expecting that it will be better for you than not trading. 10 years down the line, you might go, oh, that was a stupid trade I made, right? But that's not really what it's talking about. It's talking about when you're making the trade and when you're in the lead up to making that trade, you necessarily have to be profiting from that trade. You must value the thing you're getting more than the thing you're giving up. That's all it's saying.
I feel that there's an equivocation there between expecting to benefit and actually benefiting. You're referring it to as ex ante and
ex post.
Ex post, that's the one. Yeah, but as far as I can tell, is there any difference between benefit ex ante and ex post, between that dichotomy and the other dichotomy, which is expecting to benefit and actually benefiting?
Well, you must actually benefit when you're making the trade, right? You can't, if you still have the item, you maybe if you instantaneously have regret the moment the titles have transferred, and then you're like, oh fuck, right? But yeah, it is the expectation. You could frame it in that way, that you are expecting that what you're going to get will benefit you more than what you give up. But yeah, you could make a mistake, and that's entrepreneurship for you.
Yeah, so if I can make a mistake, then it seems like the Austrian... the Austrian conclusion is not that two people who engage in a trade mutually benefit, but that they merely expect that they will. And if that is the case, then doesn't that seem to undercut some of the reason we would use that sort of argument to support mutually beneficial trade, right? Like we say, if you're a libertarian, which I believe you are, we'd say we should let people be free to make their own decisions. And one of the many arguments we might use for that would be the economic one, right? Would be that therefore people will benefit. But you actually can't say that unless you're saying that people will make correct choices, right? So doesn't the Austrian version undercut its role as an argument in favor of voluntary trade?
I don't think the role of economics is to really get into our saying how things should be, how this or that should be. That's the role of ethics. Economics is just saying, okay, if this happens, then these will be the effects, right? Economically speaking, right? That's what economics is. So I don't think there are, say, economic arguments against slavery or economic arguments against taxation. It doesn't make sense because you need to have some ethical value as given and then use economics as a framework to say, hey, look, through economics we understand that if policy X is implemented, Y would happen, and given our ethic that Y is bad, we shouldn't implement policy X. But that is requiring you to provide some sort of ethic as given.
I definitely agree with that. You do need some ethic as well, but you said in there that the economics was a component of your argument, right? So you're saying using the economics to show this is what will happen. In this case, the argument is that people will benefit, right? But that argument wouldn't work if I understand that this is now applying economics to ethics, right? It's using economics as a component in an ethical argument. But let me kind of come at it another way. In that case, I can't, if based on the Austrian one, I can't say that a mutual trade, a mutually voluntary trade, is a mutually beneficial trade ex post. And therefore, it doesn't seem useful as a way of arguing for voluntary association.
I mean,
given.
Sorry.
Wait. Also, would you disagree there?
I was just gonna point out that, like, well, I mean, economics doesn't owe you that it's the case that the logical structure of the universe will have it, that you have this nice, neat argument to provide, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, it's not the case that you can say necessarily people will benefit from every voluntary trade ex post, but that's just not the case, you know. But you could say, and you could still do this and not abandon Austrianism, you could say that, well, if they don't, you know, regret their decision, then they will benefit. But that's just kind of saying, if they profit ex post, then they'll profit ex post, right? I mean,
yes.
you can do that, right? But there is no scientific basis for saying how often people will benefit, or aside from just saying,
I don't think that's
well, aside from just saying, well, the people who are making these bad entrepreneurial decisions will tend to not be entrepreneurs for very long because they'll start losing money, right? But that's entirely compatible with Austrian entrepreneur theory, right? That's Kerzner talks about this ad nauseum.
So, if you've got, I think we kind of agree pretty much all the way down the line here, so it's difficult to find where the disagreement is. But I suppose then I've got to kind of ask what economics is useful for to you, right? Because I agree that you can say that if two people both voluntarily engage in a trade, they both expect to benefit. I think that's, if you start laying out what those terms mean, it's kind of tautological. So I do agree that that's logically necessarily true, but I don't see how, in the Chicago sense, that wouldn't be an economic proposition, because it would have to be about the economic results for people.
Well,
right? So if that's not what the Austrian school is for, why is economics useful?
Well, that's just because I didn't want to get into a whole, like, explainer on, like, something big, right?
Okay.
I just wanted something that we could maybe get through in no time at all, right? But there are far larger theories, like, you know, economic calculation problem, knowledge problem, Austrian business cycle theory. These are very big theories that explain a whole lot, which aren't just mere tautologies. It's not just saying something like, you know, it's not just purely talking about words and how they relate to each other, right? It's actually saying stuff about the real world, and Austrian business cycle theory, for instance, comes in useful every fucking, like, decade when the Fed inevitably shrinks interest rates right down, right?
Okay. So would you say that economics is not useful in that sort of that simple Pareto argument that I was making? So voluntary trade is good because people mutually tend to mutually benefit from it, right? Because it's part of the Chicago assumption is that people will tend to use the correct means to achieve their ends, and so you can say voluntary trade is good because people benefit from it.
Well,
right?
I don't.
So you're saying economics is actually not useful in that area?
I don't think for that in particular, I don't think you need to assume that people will tend to use correct means towards ends. I don't think you need to assume that, because we could just, you know, implement Austrian entrepreneurship, right? And just say, well, those entrepreneurs who make bad predictions will tend to not be entrepreneurs for very long. So, you know, you have this kind of survival of the fittest going on. And you can say all that purely with an Austrian theory.
But that's now a reason to expect that people will correctly take actions to
right, but we didn't need to assume it, was my point. Because you were... The Chicago's, and you say this in your video, is, well, we assume that they will do this. Well, we don't have to assume anything. We can derive that it will tend to be this way.
When you're doing an economic analysis, so what I'll assume is outside of my analysis of economics, I won't assume that, right? So in my day-to-day life, I will sometimes be able to predict people's irrationality, right? I can see, like, I think this person's going to make this certain mistake, right? And I'll prepare for that. That's because I'm not using economics as Chicago school economists would define it in that situation. So outside of economics, I can absolutely come up with arguments for why we should assume that people, in some situations, we should assume that people will correctly choose means to achieve their end. However, those arguments are not economics, because a Chicago economist is going to define economics as that way of thinking that is based on the rationality assumption, right? So, yeah, you can come up with arguments for it. It's when I say it's an assumption, I don't mean it's baseless entirely. I mean that it's the starting point. It's the axiom from which economics starts, right? It's that first point. So go ahead.
Surely this would just be an inferior economics, because, you know, if everything in Chicago school is coming from this assumption that this axiom, we could say, that people will tend to implement the correct means towards some ends, well, that's just going to be a subset of praxeology. We already know that it's going to be the case that towards the limit, we'll have better and better entrepreneurs, i.e. people who are better able to actually implement and arrange means towards their ends, right? We already know that. So this is just going to be a subset, at best a subset of Austrianism, but I think the Chicagoites, they bring in all sorts of extra stuff, which doesn't simply derive from this core axiom, right? They have all these models where they're like, okay, right, I know the assumptions of this model are false and crazy and aren't actually correct, but, you know, maybe this model can help us with something, right? But then you're not really doing science there. You're doing entrepreneurship, right? Maybe at best, or maybe you're just doing like hocus pocus witchcraft at worst.
No, I think that is what science is. So when you're doing when you're trying to analyze a certain situation, what you're creating is a model, right? I understand that Austrians will often dislike the idea of using a model, but that is what thinking is, right? Every time anyone has ever thought about anything, they've used a model. You basically have a model in your head of how the universe works, and you take actions based on how that model runs. And if the model is relatively similar to the real world, you'll take good actions. If it's very dissimilar, you'll take bad ones. I think that you're creating a model of how humans act. And the reason you do that is because when people are irrational, it is difficult to predict what they're going to do. People being rational, the realm of rational human action in the Chicago sense is a very broadly applicable one that you can actually work through. Right? It would be possible, in theory, to perfectly model every mind of every person in the world and perfectly predict how the economy will run out. Right? But in that case, like, you're essentially going to have to create a duplicate of everyone on Earth. So that's not feasible.
I'm not sure that would be possible, right? We could.
Is this going to get philosophical?
Probably. So we'll maybe step back from there.
Yeah.
I do have
Let
this.
me try a different.
I do have another point written down here.
Sure.
So when I squint and look at that argument, it was like, well, people think with models all the time, so therefore let's yada yada yada.
People can only think with models.
Yeah, so people are thinking with models, therefore we should do economics based on models. But I mean, would we apply the same logic to logic itself, for instance, or mathematics? People are thinking with logic, so thinking with models. So let's make all of science about models. Let's say, let's say the law of non-contradiction. Let's go out and find whether the law of non-contradiction is true, right? We need to have this model and then test it.
That's not what I've said. So I'm not saying that I'm not saying that a logical structure is going to be an inferior model of something, right? What would it be a model of? A logical structure is a way that you figure through the models in your head. When I'm trying to test something, I'm not going to test the law of non-contradiction because that's part of the structure of logic, which I'm using to test the real world.
Right, so maybe
I assume things are what they are, and that's necessary in this internally logically consistent model of the world that I have, right? But it's the law of non-contradiction isn't itself part of that testable world.
So let's maybe let's just take the example of if there is a raise in money goods without a corresponding raise in non-money goods, raise in supply, I should say, then social wealth will not increase, but merely prices will go up, right? Would you say that this is something which we need to go out and test?
It will depend on the definitions of a lot of the words you're going into then, but based on the definitions that I would use, yes, I'd say it's test.
Well, what would you say? Surely a money good is just a universal medium of exchange, right? Would you have a different definition?
No. So I agree that empirically it is true that an increase in the supply of money. So remember you used the term social wealth? What is social wealth in an Austrian view?
Yeah, maybe that was a little bit flimsy, right? So let's just say it will not, if everybody's money is correspondingly increased, it will not increase their welfare. They will not have a greater utility. They will not be able to attain more ends from just having more money, assuming their end isn't just to have more money, right?
Well, so I can come up with very silly counterexamples. There might be some vaguely plausible ones. that a very clever person could come up with. But there's some ridiculous ones which are still nonetheless logically possible. That would be a counterexample, thus at least demonstrating and it's not merely a logical structure. So if there are people who just find really big numbers to be more inspiring, right? Which I think people probably do, but it's just not that large of an effect. They might be more willing to get up and work and do more things if they have a larger number in their bank account, even if it were to be worth just as much, right? So like, people might be more willing to work if they have $100 an hour rather than $10 an hour, even if that $100 an hour would buy just as much as that $10.
Yeah, I get you.
Right.
Well, this is what happens when
Sure.
I go off script and try and come up with something off the fly. It doesn't work.
Right.
So let's say I don't want to just go back to mutual profit. But I also don't want to get into a huge fucking dealio about economic calculation problems. I need more intermediate ones. Let's go with
Keynesianism.
Let's go with interpersonal conflict is possible only in scarce goods, right? Is this something that we would have to go out and test?
I'd have to think about that. Interpersonal conflict is possible only with scarce goods. It depends on what your definition of scarce goods is here. Like, what is a scarce? I'll assume that we both mean not infinite by scarce. But what do you mean by a good?
So a good is something which is by definition increasing your utility, right? Otherwise it would be a bad, right?
I'd agree with that. So basically I'd need to think of an example of what people could fight over without scarce goods. Like, I think that it's true that you can't, only insofar as that's tautological and therefore less useful. So if I was to say, I want to beat you up because I just really hate you, right? You could reckon that as a conflict over scarce goods.
Yeah, because my body is scarce, right?
Because your body's scarce. However, like at that point, sure, right? That's necessarily
I know
true,
of an
but I
easy
don't
idea
consider that-
of a non-scarce good, like intellect ideas, right? We couldn't have a conflict over an idea.
What's intellectual property then?
It's a lie. It's a spook, as the Sternerites like to say.
I get it's garbage. I'm anti-IP, but people do have fights over intellectual property, do they not?
I don't think that's an actual conflict over the idea in question, because I suppose these are, colloquially you could say, well, they're fighting over this idea or what have you. They're not actually trying to implement. It's because I define conflict as contradictory action, right? So, if you said, I hate shirts that are red, and I was wearing a red shirt, and I said, hey, fuck you, buddy. We might say that we're fighting over the idea of whether red shirts are good or not.
Yes.
But that's not, praxeologically, that isn't what's occurring. I'm punching you in your face, so we're having a conflict over the use of your face, right? And that's a scarce good right there. I assume you like your face to not be punched.
Right. So I totally agree that you can have an issue, over scarce goods, right? There can only be a conflict over scarce goods in the way that you're defining it. Right? That seems to be tautologically true, though. So the claim is not that you can't have a logical structure, right? This is exactly the same answer I gave with the law of non-contradiction. My claim is that either you're going to have something that is not useful in predicting what will happen, right? You can't either your model will be useful in predicting what will happen, or it will be necessarily true. It can't be both.
Well, what about economic calculation problem? Do you disagree with that?
The economic calculation problem doesn't tell us how big of a factor that will be. So I have for example, I'm not sure if I agree with him, but Brian Kaplan has an argument, which is at least plausible, that economic calculation had almost nothing to do with the famines under the USSR, right? That it was just the good old-fashioned incentive problem, right? That they were just killing people who were productive. That was why. The economic calculation problem is a fine logical structure. It does give you a plausible guess about how the world might work, but in reality, if you go and look at the famines in the USSR, was it really that the sellers were not able to calculate the correct prices? Or was the main problem simply that the government was going to kill you for being productive so you didn't be productive?
Right, so this is the kind of distinction I see between economics and historical analysis, right? It is, we know for a fact that without economic calculation, things will be worse off by people's own perception than otherwise, right? If you raise the minimum wage, you'll have more unemployment than otherwise, right? You don't know how much necessarily, but that's a question not for economics, but for historians, right? You look back and you see, you can form your historical analysis with economic theory. That's perfectly fine. Happens all the time. But that's not making up the core of economic theory, because economic theory should be applicable throughout all of time, right? And that's. I
agree.
I think that's what I see. That's what I see as economics. Is just the core of economic theory. I think that is core entirely Austrian.
I think that every school of economics agrees that there is such a thing as economic theory. At this point, as far as I can tell, this is a purely semantic disagreement. What you are calling economics, I would just call economic theory, and that's a part of economics, right? And then the applications of that theory to trying to actually make predictions about the real world, like I'd still count that as part of economics. You would count that as maybe history. I'm not really sure what you'd call it.
Yeah, I would just say,
applied economics.
That could maybe work, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, if we're talking about applied economics, in that case, this is purely, this is purely a semantic distinction. But if that's the case, why do Austrians define it this way if that puts them at odds with the rest of the economic profession? Like, if it's really the case that you guys are totally fine with empirical analysis, you just don't think that that's part of economics per se, like, why use that language rather than the mainstream language, which, all the other schools of economics use?
Well, that's because I think the other schools of economics, I don't think they're having this where it's like, oh yeah, of course, the core of economic theory is all apodictically true, but then we can go off and analyze these things empirically, right? I don't think these other schools are saying that. I think they are empiricists to their core. I think they are logical positivists for the most part.
I guess I just empirically, I don't agree with that. I think that
well, apodictically, I agree with it.
At the very least, in the Chicago versus Austrian sort of thing, we had Murray Rothbard and David Friedman. David Friedman, at the very least, says that economics, right? We use economic theory to come up with plausible guesses about how the world might work.
See, that's
right? And then we test those. And the coming up with plausible guesses part is economic theory, right? If you read one of the textbooks that he wrote that university students around America have been reading, the thing that they will understand as economics is going to be both economic theory, which is, I don't know about apodictically true, but it's it's a logical framework, and also they will have the empirical understanding of the results of those theories, and you'll do that because you want to know, is this particularly logical framework actually useful for me to understand?
That framing there, that's why I don't think that Austrians are the same as these other schools, because paraphrase Freeman there saying that, well, economic theory is coming up with plausible guesses about how the world works. That's not what Austrians are doing. We're not coming up with, well, we reckon it might work this way. We're saying, well, given action, we know it works this way. We can say it's absolutely, definitely true, undeniable. This is axiomatically true. Could not ever be denied. Impossible to conceive how it could not be the case. Right? We're not just kind of saying, we reckon it'll be this way. We're saying, we know it's this way.
Okay, but, I mean, I guess really this is just one where I'd need an example. I don't... the one where people mutually benefit, right? Like, within the theory, they mutually benefit. Within their own theories, they benefit in their minds. Before they make it, they expect to benefit. But in the real world, do they benefit? Right? What I want is like a...
Well, in the real world,
a useful claim about how people actually function, right? That economics can provide.
So a raise in the minimum wage will tend to raise unemployment, right?
I think that's empirically true, but it might not be. It's I can come up with a plausible scenario in which it won't be.
Other things being equal, I should say.
Oh yeah, even other things being equal. So I mean, I suppose it depends what you mean by that. But let me give a candidate possibility. I am a incredibly rich person, and I'm hiring an enormous number of people. I want there to be a minimum wage, and so I offer everyone, if you raise the minimum wage, I will raise the wages of all my employees. It is plausible then that a higher minimum wage could actually result in higher employment, higher wages for people overall, and additionally, I'm going to hire new people. Therefore, it's going to also increase employment.
Well, I mean,
I could always... Basically, the pattern is I can always come up with someone who has weird enough preferences such that the economic law no longer holds.
Is that not changing the structure of preferences from time A to time B, though? Because he's saying, well, I want to have this many employees right now. Then, afterwards, he's changed and he's saying, well, now that the minimum wage has gone up, I want to have a bunch more employees, right?
He's saying beforehand that he will. And yes, the number of employees he wants to hire is going up. But, I mean, in the normal situation where the price goes up and the number of employees he wants to hire goes down, his preferences, like, for how many employees he wants to hire change then also. So if that doesn't count as all else equal, then I'm not sure what the argument's saying.
So...
Right, with this pregnant pause, I will jump in and say we have been going for
it's
over
a beer
half an
belly.
hour. So I will go. I will go. Jump in and say this question has been going for about half an hour. So I'd ask you to wrap it up so we can move on to the next question. So I'm not saying stop. Just stop now. Let's just call these last couple of points your last points on this question.
I'm happy to just leave it that point there myself. I think I've kind of gotten the gist of what I'm trying to say out. You?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Okay, so next question will be, what is a major fundamental flaw of the opposing school that you cannot reconcile with your own beliefs on economics? And we'll begin with you, Danny.
So we've already gone through kind of a few of them. I'm just wondering which one I want. Well, before I actually choose this one, Liquid Zulu, do you want to debate indifference curves? Or is that a bit boring? Okay, yeah. So is indifference a valid concept would be the essential point that I'd want to go into. Like, when someone's talking about their foundations of economics, where they build their logical theory up from. If you're an Austrian school person, you will reject the concept of indifference, and if you are neoclassical, Chicago school, even most Keynesians, behaviorists, pretty much every other school I can think of, they will basically base it on the idea of indifference, right? It's that you will... I'm willing to exchange A for B. That means that I value A more than B. I'll be willing to keep exchanging A's for B's until I no longer value the next A more than the next B. So there will be a point at which I would be indifferent between an A and a B. And at that point, I shall stop trading. Right? And that is the basics of indifference. Now, there are a couple of ways that Austrians will reject this. I guess I could quote some Rothbard, but I probably don't want to put words into Liquid Zulu's mouth. So, do you think that indifference is a valid concept? Do you think it's valid, but you just can't draw curves out of it? What's your thought on that?
I think indifference is irrelevant for economics. Like, I think, was it Callahan? He made his article why he's not an Austrian economist. Was that him? Might have been him. Kaplan, that's the one. Yeah. So he was like, well, I have this red jumper and I have a blue jumper, and I'm indifferent which color I choose. So I go for the red one. So I don't actually value red jumpers over blue jumpers. It's like, well, this is misunderstanding what choice is. He's indifferent for color. Cool. So he's not, color just isn't playing into his action. It isn't playing into his weighing of his options. Just as the electron spin of different clothes, different shirts in my cupboard aren't playing into it, If I pick the closest one to me, we can maybe say that I did that because I didn't want to rummage through all my different shirts, but maybe I looked through all of them and found a really nice one. Well, for some reason, I must value that one over the other ones I didn't pick, right? It might be for convenience, for electron spin, if I'm really autistic. It might be for any number of reasons, but the reasons which I'm indifferent on aren't relevant for economics.
That seems to be literally the point of indifference, though. It's the point at which you stop acting. Saying that indifference, I won't act based on indifference, therefore indifference is irrelevant for economics. Like, how could that be? If I necessarily will not act upon indifference, then that seems incredibly useful for understanding when I will and will not act, and what I will act upon. I mean, is it not? Like, I will trade A's for B's until I'm indifferent between them.
Right, but this is... so, specifically what you're talking about there is the indifference curve, right? So, this makes some, faulty assumptions. You're assuming, for instance, that goods can be divided into arbitrarily small economic units, right? You could have like, well, at the point, the curve goes through the point of x equals 0.67 and y equals 1.673 or something crazy like that. But it's like, well, economic units are discrete. They aren't, you can't cut an economic unit up in half and say, well, I'll take half of this bundle of 3 eggs that I need to make my cake, right? It's not perceived in that way to the actor.
Yeah. So there's two responses to that. One is that it depends what you mean by cutting things up infinitely. I can think of ways in which we do actually value things on an infinitely granular
Coke bottle.
Coke bottle?
I was hoping you were going to go for the Coke bottle example.
I'm actually not familiar with that one.
You gave it.
What? I gave a Coke bottle? Oh, right. Are you talking about just the drink?
Yes.
I don't think I mentioned specifically a Coke bottle, so I was thrown. I thought there was some other thing.
Maybe I was thirsty at the time.
Fair enough. Yeah. So I probably went with a beer actually, but
yeah, potentially.
In any case, yeah. So like, there is a sense that you apparently do have heard before, in which we do value things in infinitely small steps. I'll assume from the fact that you know it that you think that doesn't count. But if it
Right.
doesn't, then what we're drawing here is an indifference curve. It doesn't literally need to be curvy. It can be jagged. Why is... I'm not on camera, so I can't really sort of gesture with my hands, but you can just imagine a curve being like pixelated almost, like it following the outline of the pixels.
It's like a set of
units
stairs.
of economics. Pardon?
Like a set of stairs.
Yeah, like a set of stairs, right? When you zoom in far enough, sure, it will probably look like that if it is really down to units. And that will mean that, strictly speaking, your perfectly smooth curve will not be accurate, and that's true. However, it will certainly be close enough to be useful, right? The same way that a computer screen displays actually a jagged sort of set of stairs, but that's useful for all of our computering purposes. It's close enough to a curve.
Right, but that's because our brains smooth things out. They smooth out all those bumps, and, I can hear Hayek screaming in his grave right now about how in economics you don't want to be doing this whole smoothing out business. That's the role of statistics. And that's what his knowledge problem's all about, right?
Well, isn't this starting to get back into the definition of economics, right? I would say that you're still doing economics when you note that indifference curves are pretty close to a description of human preferences, right? They do describe it, and therefore I can reason some things based on them, and those conclusions can still be true, even though I did draw a smooth curve and I didn't draw really tiny little jagged steps. I could just sidestep this. Sure, like everyone should be drawing tiny little jagged steps. However, does that really change any of the conclusions about indifference?
Well, I mean, then we're just back to discrete indifference, i.e., I prefer... Well, you're the indifference guy. Give me an example of an actual discrete example of, X is apples, Y is oranges, or whatever, where we meet a point of indifference between apples and oranges.
Well, sure, I've got a whole bunch of apples, you've got a whole bunch of oranges. All schools of economics agree on diminishing marginal utility, so I will just use that. I'm going to sell one of my apples for one of your oranges. I still value the next one, so the next orange more than my current apple, so I'll keep trading those apples to you for your oranges until I no longer prefer the apples to the oranges, right? Until I no longer prefer your oranges to my apples. But somewhere between the amount that I currently have and the next orange is my point of indifference.
Well, but we're only dealing with discrete units here, though. So
so I won't actually have the difference, but
then if
there must be a point between what I have, because there will be a point between what I have now and let's say it goes down to 5 apples. I've got 5 apples left. My fifth apple, I value my fifth apple more than an orange, so I'm going to stop trading here. So my fifth apple, and somewhere between my fifth apple and my sixth apple, there will be a point of indifference where I don't prefer one or the other. Now, I will simply not make that trade because a half of an apple might be considered a different good to me, right? So I'll simply just not make the trade. But there will still be that hypothetical point of indifference between those two entities, yeah? There'll be a point at which it changes from valuing apples to valuing oranges.
I mean, then this is just describing it's not describing indifference, because you're not indifferent between apples and oranges. You are preferring the oranges over the apples, or vice versa, right?
What would you call the turning point? Indifference seems like a perfectly fine word for it.
Well, I mean, you're not indifferent between them, though, because at any given point, because we're dealing discretely and not, we're not in, calculus here, where it's infinitely smooth, right? Because it's in discrete units, there is no point of indifference, as I see it, where,
What if I land on it, though? So
what would that look like?
At that point, I would not trade the apple for the orange, right? If I'm exactly indifferent between the apple and the orange, right, I'd just not trade it because there will be some transaction costs involved.
But then you've demonstrated that for some reason, i.e. transaction costs, you prefer to keep what you have. So you value keeping it more than giving it up.
Right, but then we're talking about apples and oranges. And I mean that literally. I'm not using the idiom. So we're talking about how do I value an apple as compared to an orange. We weren't talking about how do I value an apple as compared to an orange with transaction costs factored in.
I mean, isn't that not what trade is all about? It's demonstrating whether you prefer A over B, because you're willing to trade A for B. Yada yada.
Yeah, but that simplifies out transaction costs, which is usually which was fine sometimes. Often it isn't actually, but So when you factor out transaction costs, you can make that simple statement. Once you add in transaction costs, are we counting the transaction costs as part of the apple or part of the orange?
Well, I mean, if all we're doing is having demonstrate preferences, right? Because that's what we're looking for here, because it's what you're demonstrating, then it has to be included, right? It has to be rolled up in there. Because you're demonstrating that you prefer to keep what you have rather than get what they have. So it's a demonstrated preference, because we can't peer into people's minds.
Yeah, but I guess I'm not really following the issue with indifference still. You agree that there is a point where it changes from preferring one to preferring the other, right? Do you agree that indifference would be a reasonable word to use for the point at which it swaps, right? Because if there's a point at which it swaps from one to the other, what would you call that point?
Well,
even if it's not some point that you ever expect to actually be at, right?
But I don't think it's possible to be at that point.
Closer or further?
I don't think you can be at that point, is my point. I don't think it's possible.
How could that be?
It's because you're always going to be trading and demonstrating your preferences when you're trading. You can't ever demonstrate that you are indifferent between two things. You don't care. It's not the realm of action, because you don't care about them. It's not playing into it, right? So it's not going to play into your action. So it's not about economics doesn't care about it, right? So economics doesn't care about it.
No, it does, because that's where you stop acting. Right?
You're still acting. You're still acting. You're just not.
Stop acting with regards to that.
Yeah, but this just doesn't play into your action. I'm indifferent towards the electron spins in basically everything I own, right? I have this cool electron spin meter, which I really care about the electron spins in. But everything else, I don't care about it, right? So it doesn't play into my action. It doesn't play into my model of reality, to borrow your words, right? I don't care about it. So it's not impacting me. It's not impacting my choices.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is, because you're not. It's the actions that you're not taking, right? The actions you're not taking also determine the results for you, right? You didn't run a mile today, and therefore you are not as tired as you otherwise would be, right? So a state of mind in which you will not act is useful for understanding action also. No?
I mean, I'm not sure how to word it right. It's that those things which do not play into my evaluation of, my scale of values, those things which do not affect where I'm ranking different ends on there, they will not affect what I am choosing to pursue next, because I'm always going to be pursuing the highest valued end, and anything I'm indifferent to, by definition, will not impact where that goes, because it's only things I'm not indifferent to which change my rankings of these values, right? By definition.
I feel like we've gone round in a circle on that one a few times. Do we want to hit the next question?
Sure, and I've also got a real doozy on your utility point. That's the one which really got my gears grinding. But we'll save it. I imagine it'll come up.
Oh right, I remember where I posted Walter Block's badly drawn Monopoly curves.
Yes. Interpersonal comparison utility. Steam was shooting out my ears.
Oh my goodness.
Right, so next question. Do you think... how shall I word this? Do you think there is a particular theory that has been introduced by your particular school that makes it indispensable to the economic world, which otherwise would not be able to be explained by the opposing school? And we'll begin with you, Danny.
Oh man, I get to start every time.
I just thought you had agreed for you to go first, but if you want to switch over to Zulu, he can go first.
Let's let Zulu have first crack at a question for once.
I have a real quick one. I think there are really... It's difficult to narrow it down to just one, right? I'm not going to go on a whole spiel or anything. I would just say Austrian business cycle theory and economic calculation / knowledge problem. These two things, Hayek won a fucking Nobel Prize for a knowledge problem. That one's been incorporated into mainstream economics. They still reject Austrian business cycle theory because, they got to get that Fed buck somehow. But that one's still very, very much true and very much relevant. So that would be my answer to that.
So wait, your example of...
Particular theory that has been introduced, which makes my school indispensable, is, my two examples were Austrian business cycle theory and economic calculation problem / knowledge problem.
It's not just what makes... It's not... to clarify, it's not just what makes your school indispensable. It's what makes your school indispensable that would not also be able to be explained using the... basically using the opposing school.
Well, I don't think either of those could be explained through Chicago economics. Because I don't think it has a whole lot of explanatory power, because it's not based in fact.
So, Chicago School of Economics is, in theory, all good with the economic calculation problem and with Austrian business cycle theory. But only in theory. I probably don't want to hit Austrian business cycle theory because that's not my area of expertise, but I'll say a quick word on it. At least to me, it seems that it's possible that it's wrong, right? No, I shouldn't say that. It's possible that it doesn't explain the actual business cycles that we see. Right? Sure, it's in principle... you can have this logical framework, which is Austrian business cycle theory, that doesn't show us that the Great Depression, for example, was an Austrian business cycle. Would you agree with that?
Sorry, I've been twisting my mic knob down before in between, so I had to twist it back up.
Let me quickly just... Oh, sorry, you did hear?
Yeah, I did hear.
Oh, I gotcha.
So, the point of a business cycle is it has to be cyclic in some way. I went over this with some punter called Bob. I think it's just called ABCT debate or something like that. Or I'll probably call it he's a fucking retard, or I title my debates weird. But yeah, the point of a business cycle is that it's cyclic. It's not just any old economic downturn. It's not just, things really suck right now, right? That's why they call it a cycle. That's why Austrians are like, well, hey, the characteristic feature of these cycles is that you have this clustered malinvestment, and you have all this overconsumption, and you have, all this gobbledygook going on in the boom, and then you have a bust which will follow inevitably. And then because it's cyclic, and the Fed keeps the rates artificially low, you'll have another boom, because that's their solution to everything. They just say, well, you got a hangover, do a couple of shots of vodka, it'll solve it, right? You get another boom, and then another bust, and then another boom, and then another bust. It's a cycle, feeds into itself.
Yes. But the question is the bust that happened, that we refer to as the Great Depression, or the 2008 financial crisis. I have heard these referred to by Austrians as examples of Austrian busts, right? That is part of the business cycle, as it said. Is that not now an empirical claim? Right?
Yes,
sure,
yes, it
you
is.
have your logical. Okay.
And Austrians accept this. Austrians aren't completely opposed to using empiricism ever. There's the joke that we hate math and whatnot, but we're fine with looking to specific historic examples and seeing, okay, what played into this. And there's this whole field of Austrian historical revisionism, Democracy, the God That Failed, for example, right? You are looking at these specific examples and using the economic theory to inform what is going on here, right? You're looking at what's going on there. But that is an empirical claim to see whether or not something we call bust X, was it actually a bust? As in, was it part of this boom-bust cycle?
Okay, well, in that case, that seems like that is entirely compatible with the Chicago School, because so Milton Friedman is probably a good example of a Chicago School economist, if anyone is. His position on the Austrian business cycle theory was that it was logically plausible but empirically false. Right? He had this plucking model, which, like I said, not my area of expertise, but he believed that was a better description than the Austrian business cycle theory.
I could have sworn I had a plucking model note somewhere, but I can't find them now.
Well, I probably won't be able to get into it too deeply with you. Macro, as far as I can tell, is all a big clusterfuck, and so I haven't really come to any very confident conclusions on it. But yeah, the whole Austrian business cycle thing, if I believe the question was about something that the other school could not provide, the Chicago School could absolutely advocate that the Austrian business cycle theory is correct, and that's compatible with the Chicago way of doing things. And in its compatibility with the Chicago way of doing things, you'd need to empirically analyze it. The reason that you see lots of Chicago School economists opposed to the Austrian business cycle theory is just that they think that, well, yeah, that business cycle theory doesn't actually explain all of the big depressions and recessions we see. There's other factors that are more impactful.
Right, but that is kind of already rejecting on a theoretic basis, because if you accept the theoretics of Austrian business cycle theory, if it is compatible with the theoretics of Chicago economics, then you already agree. You wouldn't have to go out and test it. But the fact that they're saying, well, we need to go and test this thing,
Hold on,
is saying, well, no, this is... It's fine applying the theory to any given situation, but none of these applications of it are ever going to disprove the theory. That's the point, right? It's fine to try and apply this theory to any given scenario which happened in the past, but the point that the fact that the Chicagoites are saying, well, this looks plausible, let's go out and test it. Well, that's saying that they're rejecting its theoretic basis.
No, what we mean is that is a plausible description of these economic downturns that we keep seeing. Right? There does seem to be a pattern where lots and lots of businesses do well, then lots and lots of businesses do badly. Right? That seems to be a pattern. It goes up and down. Where cometh this pattern? And one plausible explanation is the logical framework of the Austrian business cycle theory. And I suppose by an Austrian standard, that would mean that Chicagoites actually do accept Austrian business cycle theory, right? You'd say that we do accept it. It's just that when it comes to applying it to the real world, Chicagoites just don't think it actually does apply, or at least most of them don't think it does apply to most actual economic downturns we see.
I mean, I call that into question because Friedman was all around saying, hey, we need all this quantitative easing, start pumping money into this bitch, right? That's
Sure.
if he was really clung to the core of Austrian business cycle theory and said, yes, this is correct, he wouldn't be advocating these things, right? Unless he just loves to see these downturns, right? Maybe he does. Maybe he was a secret downturn lover the whole time.
Hold on. Because he doesn't think that it's a significant thing in practice, right? Sure, yeah, like the logical structure of the Austrian business cycle theory could explain, in principle, the upturns and downturns that we empirically actually see in the real world. However, once we look at them, according to many Chicagoites, including Friedman, despite its theoretic validity, doesn't seem to be what's doing the work.
Right.
And
but you might think that this wasn't the thing which did the work in these situations, but why on earth would you want to exacerbate the problem by then advocating that they engage in quantitative easing and all these measures? Like, because if you agreed with the theory, you would know that would exacerbate things. So why would you want to exacerbate things?
You would not, because that's an empirical claim about the real world, and there you would need to...
That's a theoretic claim, is the point. So if you agreed with the theory that if the Fed does all these meddlings, then this will happen.
Whether it actually will, in the real world, affect significant changes, that is entirely empirical. Well, I mean, you can have a theoretical framework to begin your empirical analysis, but you do need an empirical analysis.
It's like if I saw you... It's like
let me put it this way. Let's say that you've got... I agree, the Austrian business cycle thing is real, and it is responsible for 0.02%. It's just a number out of my ass. I'm not prepared to defend the number. 0.02% of the economic ups and downs that we see. Right? It's this really trivial aspect of the real empirical movements of our economy. Right? I could accept Austrian business cycle theory, but just think, but who cares? Right? There are more important factors at play.
Right. So my main point, like the key of my point here, is why on earth would he advocate to make it 0.02% worse? Because like if he agrees that the theoretics is correct...
Because in doing so, it'll make it 50% better, according to him. Right? That, again, number out of my ass. But if there are other larger factors at play, ones for which an increase in the money supply during an economic downturn is a positive thing, then it may be the case that overall it will actually make things better, right? But once again, that would depend on whether you accept the plucking model. I'm not sure if I do. I'm not willing to defend everything every Chicagoite has ever said, but the general model, like,
I mean, you're the acolyte of Chicagoites here. I was told you were Patrick Friedman.
Every Chicago. I agree with David Friedman more than Milton, and David Friedman describes macro, which is what all of these theories are, as either a visit of a construction site or a graveyard, right? That everything in there either seems like maybe it could explain some stuff, but we still need to do more work, or has just been utterly, completely defunct. But there's nothing in macro that seems particularly compelling, and I agree with that. I am not sold on any of these macro theories.
Anyway, on that note, I would like to go take a piss, and then we can go to the next question.
Okay, fair enough.
Your question really made me want to piss. I'm sorry.
I don't know how to take that.
Compliment.
Okay. Maybe one day I'll be willing to do a moral philosophy stream, but that's not what I'm prepared for today.
Yeah, that's more than fair enough. Okay, so
Moral philosophy, you say?
God, no.
Of course, that's when you come back. Anyway, so I guess we'll move on to the final question of the evening, which is, if you had to pick 3 things that you didn't like about if you had to pick 3 things that you didn't like about the opposing school, which you think are answered by your school, what would they be? What? And either of you can go this time. I really don't mind.
3 things.
Yeah.
Well, I just have to get rid of 2 of them from my list. Yeah, I'd probably actually say that in this discussion, as well as many others, it seems slippery. So Austrians do accept empirical analyses, but it's not part of economics. But then it seems like that's going to mean that economics has nothing to say about the real world, so you can't say these things apodictically. Whereas Austrians do seem to make claims about the real world. So it doesn't seem to me very clearly defined when they're talking about just their theories in and of themselves and when they're talking about the real world, unless they're going to say that they can say something about the real world in economic terms, which is just based on economic theory alone, which I'm still skeptical of. So that slipperiness would be number 1. Maybe it's just my failure to understand, but it seems it's way to me. There's also the rationality assumption. I just think I would rather a rationality assumption that allows me to make useful predictions about the world, and not worry about whether I can prove it apodictically. As far as I can tell, I can't prove anything completely apodictically. Like, I do think that there are things that are necessarily true, but I don't think I can prove them. That's intuitionism for you. And probably the last one would be one we kind of missed, but there's this rejection of interpersonal comparison of utility, which seems valid at first, and there's a sense in which it is valid, but in practice, we all do compare utility interpersonally, right? We all do say, I'd rather give Ted this concert ticket than Fred because Ted likes that band more than Fred, right? That
I thought you were going to say I thought you were going to say something else there. I would rather give head than give some other kind of sexual act. Like, fucking hell, man, calm down.
Right. No,
right.
Tickets to see a concert. Goodness me.
Right.
Anyway, so yeah, I think that there are interpersonal values comparisons that are valid. I even think that cardinal utility is kind of a useful concept in a lot of situations. Yeah, I know, goodness me. So yeah, the fact that Austrians reject these patently useful concepts on the grounds that they don't fit into this apodictic theory, I think that is a flaw. I think that was 3, wasn't it?
Yeah, it seems like it. So Zulu, your 3. What are 3 things within the Austrian school that you think? What are 3 things in the what are your 3 things? I suppose I should just say.
What are the 3 things supposed to be? I forgot the question. I was too busy gasping.
3 reasons that the Chicago school sucks. Basically.
No, 3
number
reasons
1, stinky. Number 2, dumb. Number 3, bad. There you go.
3 things that.
Number 4, Burger King foot lettuce.
Fucking hell, man.
That's the throwback now.
Yeah. 3 things that make which make the Austrian school basically 3 things that make the Austrian school superior to the Chicago school. 3 observations which which ultimately put the Chicago School at a shall we say an analytical advantage over the Chicago School.
Well, first off, the Austrians are correct on methodology. They have that completely in the bag. Austrian epistemology far better than Chicago epistemology. From that, we are able to get to observations such as, well, it's necessarily true that without factor prices, things will be worse for people's, by their own perception, than otherwise. And we also have, Austrian business cycle theory, all sorts of lovely stuff. That'll just be my 3 though there, and then I like to go right into the jabbing at this socialist over here, who thinks we can have interpersonal comparisons of utility. So yeah, I watched your video earlier. You have this. I'll reiterate your hypothetical. So we operate on the basis of interpersonal comparisons of utility, and correct me if I'm wrong at any point here. So if you have like 2 friends and you have 1 spare beer, and you might choose like, okay, right, I reckon John will like it better than Derek because I think John will like it more than Derek would like it. Is that an accurate representation of your example?
I think I used a concert ticket, but yeah, that's it. Yes, correct. Good. Well done.
Yes. So I would say this is equivalent to me saying, well, I might give it to John instead of Derek because I think John is better at making fires. Therefore, he should get the beer. Or I think John is better at making square circles. Therefore, he should get the beer. Right? It's just as logically valid. It doesn't follow that because John is better at making fires or square circles, that therefore he should get the beer. It doesn't follow. This is why
Correct.
This is not a proper framework for economics. We cannot determine who I will choose to give it to based on some interpersonal comparison of utility. We only know that, well, I will give it to whoever I think will raise me on my scale of values more. Whichever one I give it to, I think that will benefit me more. That we can say.
Sure.
And the objectivists are going to love this.
But when you're doing that analysis of which one is going to benefit you more, you note the fact that you care about both of these people. Perhaps you care about them equally. You might be indifferent between them. Oh, goodness.
no.
But you care about both of them roughly equally within those units, such that if one of them liked it a bit more, then that could make the difference, right? It's not that I'll always give it to John rather than Derek. It's just that it's not that I'd always give anything to John rather than Derek. It's just that I know that John really likes this band, so I'll give them the ticket. Or he really likes this beer, so I'll give him the beer, right? So he likes it more than Derek. And I think that is how you decide which one is going to benefit you more, right? Which one is going to provide you with the most psychic benefit? Well, the one who likes the thing more. Liking something more than someone else is an interpersonal comparison of value, is it not?
It is, and that's why it has no basis in science. This decision,
oh my goodness,
it's a heuristic that you might apply. You're like, I reckon, John will like it more. That's a heuristic, right? It's not actually embedded in science. You couldn't actually go out and say, John would like it more than him, because it doesn't make any sense to say that. It's equally as consistent to say, well, I'll give it to John instead of Derek because pepper is black, right? It's just as consistent, right?
Do you really find that to be just as compelling, right? Like, so.
Well, yeah, this is why economics isn't psychology, right? Psychology might be like, well, I have this heuristic that I reckon John will benefit from this more, right? But that's just going to be a heuristic. It's not going to be actual actually based in science. We can't base these heuristics in science. It's impossible to do that.
I could.
How would you?
So if you want me to get really technical about it, I could get once we get these brain scanning technologies and we fully map people's connectomes, I can simply find what structures do what when you prefer one thing to another, and see whose brain has those structures more pronounced with regards to this thing when introduced to a certain stimuli than another. Right? I could test it down to that degree. However, what it would show is simply the thing that we get from just observing. We would see that, John seems to get more benefit out of this than Derek, and would also see in his action, which is why this is part of economics. Like, if given the option to pay, right, John might be willing to pay more than Derek.
Right, but that doesn't imply that John likes it more than Derek, right? Because we can't get there through economics, and I don't think it even suggests it. It doesn't suggest
Really?
anything
So,
about
like,
anything, because we do.
I'm willing to give up every cent that I have for this beer. You are willing to give up 1 cent.
Mm-hmm.
You don't think that suggests that I might value it more than you?
No, because we don't know how highly each values cents, right? Because one person might value cents very lowly, right?
One might, which is why these things, none of the thing I'm saying is, I think, apodictically true, just that that appears to be the basis upon which we make decisions all the time. If we want to make those decisions better, then we could apply economic reasoning. The way we do that is you assume some kind of exchange rates, like some method by which we can determine, like, okay, sure, maybe John would be willing to spend more, but you think that that's just because John has way more money, and therefore, like, it's less of a big deal to him, right, that he gives up that amount of money, right? And you might factor that in and say, okay, well, I'm kind of mentally doing a 1 to 10 exchange rate here, but still, nonetheless, you'd be comparing values interpersonally somehow.
Right, but this is just going to be some psychological heuristic that a person is implementing. This does not have a basis in science, and economics is science, right? You can't actually get down and determine which one will like it more. I don't think that's possible. I mean, you might assume that
can.
how could you determine that?
So you can't determine it 100% certainty because it's science, right? So
This is
wait. You think that in science you determine things 100% certainly? I think
it depends whether
100% certainty is now you're outside of the realm of science.
Well, it depends whether it's an a priori or an a posteriori science. Like, a priori science, like, economics or ethics, stuff like that. You can know things with absolute certainty. Or mathematics, that's also a priori. Logic, a priori. A posteriori sciences.
Maths and logic are tautologies, right?
But it's still science.
Okay, I mean, this is all getting down to semantics. Maybe we should just go back to, like, do you, like, forget about whether it's economics or not, because I don't want the only disagreement we air to be, what does economics mean? But do you think it is valid in any context to say that John likes beer more than Derek?
I mean, it might be relevant in a social context, right? I don't think, in scientific context, I don't think it makes sense to say one person likes something more than another. So
I think that if it's useful, like if it's sensible in one context, right, a context in which we want to do stuff, in this case, give a beer to someone, then it might be reasonable to have some understanding of how the logical structure of that interpersonal value comparison you're doing works. And I find that economic theory can provide a lot of insight into that, right? So, For example, I think that people actually will benefit from mutual exchange for that reason, right? Because I think that the guy doing the forcing there are various reasons to expect the guy doing the forcing in a forced interaction is going to benefit less than the disutility of the person being forced. I think that that's usually going to be the case. And there's a lot of economic reasoning involved there in order for us to make these interpersonal value comparisons effectively. So if they're valid and economics can apply to them, then do you agree with that? They're valid and economics can apply to them?
Well, I think, I don't think there is really a logical structure behind people's heuristics. I don't think there is I don't think people go, well, I reckon Derek values it at X, Y, Z, and, John values it at ABC, and, do the calculations, therefore, I should give it to John. I don't think there is some logic that people are running through. It would be equally logically valid for me to say, well, Pepper is black, therefore, John should get it. That's equally logically valid as saying John values it more than Derek. That's just as logically valid, i.e. both are completely invalid. It doesn't follow.
Yeah, I don't mean that people actually have these calculations explicitly in their head, but they are weighing one thing up against another. So there's some attempt to do that interpersonal value comparison. My claim is that they could perform that thing that they have demonstrated they want to do, which is compare value interpersonally. They can perform that more effectively if they applied some economic reasoning to it. It's important to note that the Chicago assumption about people being rational doesn't mean that we're all computers. Right? There's no assumption that everyone thinks through everything mathematically or correctly or carefully even, right? It just means it's about what they do, not about what they think, right? So there's a sense in which evolution is rational in the Chicago sense, right? There's no pre-planning, but nonetheless, if you posit some set of objectives, which is to make organisms that survive, then you survive to reproducing age anyway. Then if you posit that as an objective, you can use that to figure out what sort of organisms evolution will design, as it were. And so, therefore, in a Chicago sense, it's evolution is behaving rationally, despite the fact that it's not thinking. All right, so that's not usually what we apply economics to, but it's just to demonstrate that Chicago school economists are not saying that people are computers who think everything through like calculators.
You mean big computer is false?
Pardon?
You mean big computer doesn't solve economic calculation problem? Big computer false?
Yeah, big computer false. Economic calculation valid. Not the main reason, most likely, that the Soviet Union collapsed, but it is valid and it is a significant issue.
To put an example to the evolution thing, you can take, for example, convergent evolution for the fact that different organisms will basically take the same general shape within
everything is crabs.
Yeah,
everything's crabs. Yeah.
A load
or my favorite example is just like whales. Whales totally look like fish, dude.
Like
they're not. Whoa.
There are certain forms of quote-unquote trees which are more closely related to grass than the other trees.
Yeah.
And like you said, there's like 1,000,001 different crustaceans that have all become crabs for some reason.
Yeah. By the way, I had to finish your shilling for you. Cause I mentioned you in the chat and I said, well, they can't click your name in the YouTube chat, so I had to link your channel for you. So I finished your shilling for you.
Oh, thank you. I did end up linking my channel in the end, but because I didn't see that. But thank you regardless.
Did you? It might have just gone to the YouTube void or something. I cannot see you linking your channel. It must just gone. Link, go away. Anyway, I do have. You said there earlier, Danny. I should say. You said, well, these people when they're making whether I should give it to John or fucking Dex. Derek, that's
I
the name I
think
used.
you said Derek.
Yeah, Derek. So yeah.
Fucking Derek.
Yeah, they are weighing... Yeah, fuck Derek, that's why he doesn't get a beer. Yeah, he said they are weighing one thing up against another. My point there is, what they're weighing is the benefit to them. What they think will increase their own utility the most. Right, that is what they're weighing.
Like, that's always true. You're always weighing what's going to increase your utility the most. Like, if I decide which beer do I want, the bigger one or the smaller one, you could say that I'm just weighing up what's going to increase my utility the most, but it would also be valid to say I'm weighing up which beer is bigger. Right? In the same way, yeah, I can just say I'm weighing up whether giving it to John or giving it to Derek is going to increase my utility the most. Totally valid. However, it is also valid to say I'm weighing up who values it more, because that's why it'll provide me with more benefit if I give it to John, because he values it more.
Well, you couldn't just reframe which beer, the bigger one versus smaller one. You couldn't necessarily reframe that into which beer is bigger, because I might...
That's one of the factors. I'm simplifying, of course.
Yeah, like that. But that's my point, is there might be all sorts of factors which go into it, but this is all going to just coalesce into which one do I think will benefit me more. That's how I'm going to choose based on. It's unavoidable. And it's the same with... I'm not actually doing an interpersonal comparison of utility when I decide to give it to John instead of Derek, because fuck Derek. What I'm doing is...
It was meant to be that you like Derek and John. You think they're both cool, and
no,
that's
fuck
why
Derek. Fuck Derek.
God damn it! Wow.
That's why you didn't get any beers from me. Yeah. Like, all we can say in science is, well, I'm going to pick the one which I would prefer to give it to. That's all we can say. And, science doesn't owe you that we can say more than that. It might be that I have some heuristic that, well, I might justify my actions through, well, I reckon John will like it more than Derek. But, if I don't think I would ever think those thoughts, because I would immediately go, fuck it. I would punch myself in the face, interpersonal comparison of utility. And I'd remember fucking Ayn Rand ghosts would come in my head and say, do self-benefit, and then I'd drink it myself, Something like that.
Okay, fair. Yeah. I think we've both made our points on that. I don't think we're going to get through that hurdle today.
Okay, well, we have passed the hour and a half mark. We're about an hour 45, so I guess we'll bring this to a close. So, first of all, thank you to Liquid Zulu and Danny for coming on and stating your cases. It's been fantastic. Thank you for keeping it civil and both making your points in an eloquent manner. It has encouraged me to want to do more of this type of content in the future. So, yeah, thank you very much. I'm really glad to have had you on tonight.
Cool,
well, thanks for having me. And thanks for the chat, Liquid Zulu. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was a bunch of fun. Ton of fun.
Right.
Tons of fun. You're way better than Derek, by the way.
Well, yeah, I mean, who isn't? It's fucking Derek.
Yeah, it's fuck Derek.
Right, okay, so thank you for watching, everyone. If you wish to find me, you can find me at Paleo Angloism or at the Anglo Den in Discord. If you wish to find my guests, their YouTube and Twitters are both in the description below. If you wish to support me, you can do so at Patreon, Subscribe Style, PayPal.me. This channel is in association with the Wellington Project. And yes, if you... this has been Chicago School versus Austrian School discussion with Danny Duchamp and Liquid Zulu for the 6th of June 2022. Have an excellent day, everyone. Bye-bye.
See, I have one question for Danny. How French is your name supposed to be pronounced? Is it Danny Duchamp? Or is it Danny Duchamp? Those are the two ends of the continuum.
I pronounce it pretty French, but honestly, like, I don't... So, different people pronounce it different ways, and I don't care. This is the short answer.
How do the Chicagoites pronounce it?
He calls me Danny Duchamp, and I don't care.
How do the Chicagoites pronounce it? Is the real question.
Well, they're not very French. They're like Scottish, so I don't know.
Danny Duchamp.
Yeah, well, because it's all based on Adam Smith, right?
Yeah, he wouldn't get my beers. I'd give it to Murray Rothbard instead.
Oh, Adams, he was alright. Like, he got
Yeah.
some stuff.
Yeah.
He was alright for his time.
Yeah. That's what the Nazis said.
Alright. I'm gonna head off now, but it was a lot of fun. I'll catch you guys later.
Yeah, see you boys.
Right, catch you up.
Boop.